Okay, well, it looks like it's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Today we have Sam Shaw, and he is our guru on numbers. So he's going to help us figure out what changes there are in the Bibliostat, the process that we use to fill out the public library survey. And with that, Sam, we'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Autumn. If you could, if I could ask that you maybe monitor the chat. If people have questions as we go along, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask. But if you don't have a microphone, for instance, just type your question in the chat, and then Autumn can stop and we can address those as they come up, instead of waiting until the end. So I'll just kind of give an overview. Some of you, I think, are familiar with the survey. You've done it before. We may have some new people here today as well. So I'll kind of give an overview of the process, and then we have a test survey that we can go through, and we'll go through parts of that to show some of the common issues or some common things that come up. As I was telling Autumn, we've had some issues with Bibliostat today, and we've reported those to our rep. Unfortunately, the developer is gone until next week, so some of these issues might not be looked at until next week, and we may experience them in the test survey, so we can show you what they look like. If you're doing your survey and you get error codes or you have any issues, let me know, and I will forward it on to them, them being our Bibliostat rep. It's good to know about the time that the date and the time that the issue occurred, and also what browser you're using. That helps them to try and troubleshoot it. So just a matter of terminology here, as Autumn mentioned. The survey is the actual name of the survey is the Public Library Survey. That's part of a national data collection program that we participate in the state of Nebraska. That's sponsored by IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So all public libraries in all states and US territories have an annual data collection cycle. Our cycle runs from approximately mid-November through mid-February is when we collect the data. And then in the spring and early summer is the time that we're cleaning data and then sending it off to IMLS to report it to them. And so our process, we usually at the state level publish our data. We try and shoot for around May and June, which coincides with the accreditation application opening, which I think is July 1st. So if you can see my screen, and let me know if you have any problems seeing my screen here, but if you go to a lot of you as public library directors would have already received an email from me with a link to the public library survey and Bibliostat, which is Bibliostat is the vendor that we use to collect the data. So if for some reason you didn't receive an email from me with your ID and password, let me know and I will resend that to you. So the survey is open for data entry right now. We open on November 15th here, and the survey will close on February 18th of 2022. So you have until then to submit your data through Bibliostat. And the survey is required if you're an accredited library. It's required to maintain your accreditation and receive state aid. If you're an unaccredited library, you can still submit the survey online, and if you do, you're eligible for a $200, we call it Dollars for Data grant through us. And that's the first step towards you being eligible for accreditation, is submitting your statistics. So if you notice here on this main page, we have some things that would help you. We have the main login, which we'll get to in a minute. And then we have a blank copy of the survey in Word format or PDF. A lot of people like to print it out or do it locally, fill in the information locally before you go on to collect and actually enter it into the data collection tool. You might want to know what changes we've made this year. The good news is that there aren't too many changes other than a complete overhaul of the programs section, which we'll get to when we go through the test survey. But if you wanted to see what changes were made, there's links to that here in PDF and Word format. Also a copy of the survey instructions. Those are also embedded in Bibliostat. But if you want to look at the instructions, there's a link here as well. FAQ, frequently asked questions. This is more about the program itself. So like how to navigate Bibliostat. The effects that are in there, which we'll get to when we go through the test survey, and other things about the navigation. Some of the questions on the survey are federally required questions. Those are in purple on our survey. Those are the ones that every state has to ask, and we have to use the federal definitions for those questions. So those are questions that would be asked in Nebraska, and they would also be asked in other states like Iowa and Missouri and all 50 states and US territories as well. If you want to look at how those questions are defined, here's a link to those federal definitions. We also have a public library survey guide for new directors. This is kind of an overview of the process and how to navigate Bibliostat. Flowchart for how to count electronic stuff. We get a lot of questions sometimes about how to count holdings in circulation for electronic items. This would be like things like overdrive for ebooks and audiobooks and databases. The good news is that most of you have or are in the Nebraska Overdrive Libraries Consortium. And if you're in that consortium, we pre-fill that data for you. We pull it and pre-fill it on your survey. So you don't have to worry about overdrive. If you have another vendor, you would have to pull that data and add it to the survey. And then if you wanted to know how we got those data from overdrive, here's a guide that shows you how we pulled that data. If you maybe want to look at those reports throughout the year instead of just at the end of the year, this shows you kind of how Devra Dragos pulls those numbers for us. And then if you have an Overdrive Advantage or Advantage Plus account, this is kind of a guide to how those numbers are pulled. And so let's go ahead and get into the test survey. And like I said, if anybody has questions as we go along, type them in the chat or unmute yourself. So if we go to the main page, it should look like this when you log in. We're going to log into the test survey. I would say that 90% of all ID and password issues that we get are because all of the IDs and passwords use zeros and not capital O's. So I would say that most of the time when you get a login error, it's due to entering a capital O instead of a zero. So keep that in mind that those are zeros. We use numbers and not capital O's. So when you log in, it should look something like this. You can print previous year surveys. So you'll notice here, like in 2019, these are surveys that have already been submitted. You'll just see the print icon, which you can print a previous year survey. We also keep a local copy of your survey from the prior years on our network at the commission. So if you wanted a PDF copy of it, you can just email me and I can send it to you as well. So we've had some people that have had issues with printing from Bibliostat. So if you experience that, you can always send me an email or give me a call and I can email you a prior year survey. So it should look something like this for the current survey. You can go in and print it. You can look at the status or continue here. So we're going to continue because we haven't entered anything. Well, I should say at the last training, we entered data. So it should look something like this. Over on the left-hand side, you have the survey navigation, broken down into parts, general data, library facility, finance, collections, services, technology, staffing, and then the narrative and certification sections. Sounds like a lot, but as you get rolling, it's really not too bad, hopefully. So if you'll notice up here, you have a button for show status. This is something that you would look at kind of after you have entered all your data. You would want to see where you're at. The system runs through a series of what we call edit checks, where it looks at the data that you entered last year and compares it to this year. Or it looks at certain things like your revenue to your expenditures. And if your data is outside of a certain range, you might get an edit check. And that means the system or the program wants to know, why there was a large change from this year to last year. So the good news is that last year, a lot of edit checks were turned off by IMLS because of COVID. So because programs maybe went down compared to the year before. Now, the bad news is that they turned those edit checks back on this year. And so what we're finding is that a library that maybe had low amounts of programming last year and now they're back up, they're getting edit checks because of that change. And so if you get an edit check, the only thing that you need to do is you need to enter a note in the note field explaining why the data is outside of that range. So in that circumstance, your note would simply be, we didn't have any programs last year, or we had limited programming last year because of COVID, or whatever the case may be. And then you'll notice here, there's a print icon, another print icon here, a submit button. This is after you've already completed your survey. You go to submit it. We'll get to that at the end. And then navigation buttons for next and save. And you'll see those at the bottom as well. There's a previous button, a previous and next button. I always tell people to click on the save button before you go to the next screen, because you want to make sure that the data on this page gets saved. Sometimes it doesn't always save when you hit next. So to be on the safe side, always hit save first and then navigate to the next screen. And don't use your browser buttons. Those can screw up the program. And one thing that I forgot to mention is the supported browser, the recommended browser is Chrome. Firefox is also a supported browser. They don't recommend IE or let's see, Edge if you have those. So I generally use Firefox, but I found that Collect plays a little nicer with Chrome. And as I said earlier, some people have gotten error codes. If that happens where a page doesn't load, sometimes you may have to close a tab and come back in, or close your browser down completely and come back in. So if that happens, let me know as well. So you'll notice here, there's a button up here at the top. This is pretty important, this show last year's answers. You all see that? So I almost always turn that feature on, and you notice when I clicked on that, then my last year's answers show up down here at the bottom. So that is really helpful because I can look at, most of the time your data should vary a little bit from year to year, but maybe not be exactly the same as last year. But if it varies a lot, then you kind of know to maybe double check things and make sure that you've got the right numbers. And you'll notice here that these are those purple questions. These are the federally required ones. You'll notice that this field is grayed out. What that means is this field is locked and you can't change this. And the reason that we lock those is because these are usually things that don't change from year to year. And if for some reason a library went in and changed their street address to, say the street address was 123 Main Street, and it was spelled out, and a library went in and changed that to ST period, that would trigger an edit check. And we don't want to trigger those edit checks because generally this stuff doesn't change from year to year. If for some reason you did move to a new address, you have built a new library, for instance, and you have a new street address, just email me and I can go in as the survey administrator and change that street address for you. Or any other field that's locked, we can go in and change it for you. And then we have to enter a note because the move to a new location triggers a lot of changes when we submit our data to IMLS. You'll also notice over here there's a flag button, and you notice when I clicked on that, that went red. That's there for you, like say you were entering your data and you remembered that you forgot to add something to your numbers that you were entering, or maybe you needed another report. That's kind of there just as a placeholder for you. So when you go to submit the survey, it's going to say you can't submit it because you've got this question flagged. So that's kind of just a reminder that you can set for yourself. So we'll go ahead and leave that on, and then at the end, it'll show up as a flagged question. And then you'll notice here, we talked about entering notes for edit checks. So you can enter a note here in the survey itself, or you can enter a note later on if you actually do get an edit check. I usually tell people if you know that this is going to trigger an edit check, you can always enter a note here. Otherwise, wait until the end. It might not trigger an edit check, and you might not need to enter a note. So I can show you how to enter the notes at the end too in the survey status button. But this is kind of what it looks like. You can look at, if it was a note that was entered in the previous year, you can click on that. Federal notes, I usually tell people if this is a federal question, if it's in purple, enter your note in the federal note field. If it's a state question that appears in black, enter it in the state note field. Local notes are more for you on your end. Like say you wanted to write yourself a local note for next year, like say your numbers came from a certain person at the city clerk's office, and you wanted to write that note in there to help you for next year. You could put something in here like contact Mary at the city clerk's office for this information. You could enter that in there. Okay, so let's move along. And you'll notice here on this question, like next to mailing address, there's a little question mark. That's what we talked about with those survey instructions. So if you click on this little question mark, and it doesn't usually show up in Zoom, but if you click on that little question mark, you'll get a little pop-up box. And so like when I clicked on that, you probably can't see it, but it tells me that for mailing address, it says enter the post office box number, otherwise leave blank. And so that's going to give me more information about this question if you had wanted to know what the definition was. And so like I said, all these fields, these are things that don't typically change. These are going to be pre-filled from the prior year, and they're going to be locked. You'll notice here's an example of the state question. So for library fax numbers, this is in black and not purple. So what that means is that's data that we collect at the state level, and it's not a federally required question. For population numbers, these will be pre-filled. We use the definition says that we are to use the official figures from the State Data Center, which is Center for Public Affairs and Research at UNO. And they use the 5-year ACS estimates from census. So those are the ones that we use for these numbers to pre-fill on your survey. Those will be pre-filled for you. That's the local population. That would be, in most cases, your legal service area is going to be the same as your local population. These might be different if a library, say for instance, served an area outside the city or the town, like say the county population. Valentine, I think, is one example. I was on the phone with Anne this morning. She was having some issues with her survey that I think serves part of Cherry County. And so like for her, the local population is the population of Valentine, and then the legal service area is Cherry County population. So if for some reason that changes sometimes, we had a couple libraries report that they are now serving the county population or an area outside the town, and we've expanded their legal service area. And I think in a couple of instances, there was one library, I can't remember which one, I think it might have been Columbus, that did serve the county before, and now they don't. So their population went down. So I'm not going to click on save because we're just in this test module. So I'm just going to click on next. But for you guys, if you're in here, always click save first to save this page and then go to the next. Anybody have any questions right off the top about survey navigation overview? No news is good news, I guess, huh? Okay, so branch libraries and bookmobiles. I don't know if anybody has any branch libraries or a bookmobile. If you did, this would be a 1. This would be, however many branch libraries you had. If you just have your one central library, and that's your administrative entity and your central library location, which is the case for probably 95% of libraries within our state, this is going to be a 0 and that's going to be a 0. And I think there's 7 bookmobiles in the state now, so it's a relatively small amount of libraries. You'll notice here, like on the accessibility question, these are drop-down menus. Just click on this little drop-down here to select a yes or no. At the state level, we want to know if you're working on a building plan or project. We ask that question because we have libraries often contact us that want to undergo a renovation, and they maybe want to know if there was another library that recently did that, so that we can put librarian A in touch with librarian B, who just maybe went through such a plan or program. And then you'll notice here, like up at the top, it says the following questions refer to outlet data, and most of these fields are locked. The reason that this shows up in a separate group is you have to be thinking about things. Like I said, I don't know if there's anybody on this call that has a branch library or a bookmobile, but you have to think about things in terms of library systems that do have branch locations. So for the branch locations, we have an ID and a street address and a library name for each branch location. We report all that data to IMLS. So like for Lincoln City Libraries, we report the administrative entity of Lincoln City Libraries and then their main central library location downtown. And then we report, the library name, street address, and everything for each branch as well. So these will all be pre-filled based upon what you entered last year. And here you'll notice the outlet type code CE is for central library. And then the library building square footage, that'll be pre-filled and locked as well based upon what you entered last year or what was entered last year. If you've had an addition to your library or maybe moved to a new building, let me know and I can go in as the survey administrator and change this square footage number. 2 fields that you'll have to keep in mind here in this section are open hours, that's in the 2.22, and number of weeks open, which is 2.23. And so things to keep in mind here for open hours is this thing right here at the end. It says minor variations in hours need not be included, but extensive hours closed due to natural disasters or other events should be excluded from the count. Okay, so kind of what I tell people in that circumstance is, say the library closed for a day or two because you had a snowstorm, or maybe some staff were sick for a few days and they couldn't report to work. You wouldn't exclude those hours from your public service hours. But if, say, your library was closed for 2 or 3 weeks because you had a flood or due to COVID, or say you had a major renovation or something, you would exclude those hours from the count. That would be an extensive hour closures. So generally you would take, the number of hours that you're open per week multiplied by the number of weeks per year. And so say, like in a common example, say you were open for 10 hours a week, and 52 weeks out of the year, you would just report a 520 here for your open hours for the year.
So question there, Sam, in the chat is, if they're closed for weather, they don't have to count it there?
Yeah, because generally that's just a minor variation. So like if you're closed, like for a snowstorm or something, that's generally you would just be closed for a few days. And so we would consider that to be a minor variation. So you wouldn't omit those hours from this. You would include that hours. If on the average you, like say you were open, like I said, 10 hours a week, and there were a couple of weeks out of the year that maybe you were open 8 hours a week or less because of like a weather event, I wouldn't exclude those. I would only exclude them if it's a major closure. Like I said, like say you had a flood or a tornado or something like that, that that closed you down for an extended period of time, then I would exclude those hours from the count. Does that answer? Yep.
I think so.
Okay, so then in 2.23, you would report the number of weeks that your library is open. So for most people, that's going to be a 52. Now, say your library was closed for a few weeks due to COVID, you would exclude those hours from the count. So say you were closed for 2 weeks due to COVID and open for the other 50. So you would just report a 50 there. And then if you'll notice here, we also have this follow-up question that was asked last year that they started asking about the number of weeks that you were closed due to COVID. And they define a closure as nobody could come into the building. So that was a common question that we got last year. We had a lot of libraries that were closed to people coming in, but they maybe had a drive-through service or curbside pickup, or other outside services that they offered. For purposes of this survey, you'll notice here, this highlighted part kind of gives you a little bit more information there. For purposes of this definition, IMLS considers your building closed if nobody could come into the building. So what this means is that if you were closed for 2 weeks due to COVID, the sum of 2.23, let me scroll up a little bit, which is your number of weeks open, and 2.24, which is the number of weeks closed due to COVID, should be 52. It can't be larger than 52 because you can't be open and closed more than 52 weeks. Now, another common question is we had a couple libraries that were closed for some reason other than COVID. So in that circumstance, this is possible that this could be a 0, but this could still be a 50. Like say you had a natural disaster, a flood that closed you for 2 weeks. You weren't closed due to COVID, but there were 2 weeks out of the year that you were closed for another reason. So you would exclude those from the count.
Would they want to put a note in for that?
You can and you can always put a note in there. Like in that circumstance, you click on this and say, we closed, we were closed for 2 weeks. Or something like that. And then just click on the save. Yeah, that's always, that would be a common thing because I would probably ask, hey, did you, were you closed for another reason? So yeah, you could always enter a note. And then we also have this question here about limited occupancy. This was also a question that's the IMLS will ask next year. And I would anticipate that likely these COVID related questions will probably go away next year. I think the intent was to collect the data for 2 years and then probably stop collecting this probably on next year's survey. Now, some of the COVID questions that were on last year's survey have now been rolled into the new programs part. So like some of these questions about virtual programming are now part of the survey and the programs part. So those will remain on the survey as in that section. So in 2.25 here, what they're asking is, so if in this example, if this library was open for 50 weeks, like we said, they want to know out of those 50 weeks that people could actually come into the library, did you have any limited occupancy practices? And they define that as, like reduced open hours, limits on the number of people that could come in at one time, time limits. Some libraries had time limits. You could come in for a certain period of time, but you could only come in for 15 minutes, for instance. Certain meeting rooms were maybe closed for a certain period of time. If you had any of those limited occupancy practices during your reporting period, which would be your fiscal year, you would just report the number of weeks that occurred here. And so you'll notice here we have a note that says the number should not be greater than 2.23, which is your weeks open. So you can't have limited occupancy, if I remember this correctly. You can't have limited occupancy without any occupancy. So this is a subset of weeks open. And if you'll notice here, we have this add group and remove group button down at the bottom. You'll see this throughout the survey. These are what we call repeating groups. So for this series of questions, you can add a group to add another series of these questions, or you can remove a group if you've accidentally added it. And so the reason that that appears here is, like we talked about before, there may be libraries that report all of these things for each outlet location or each branch. So for most of you, you just would scroll through this, but that's the reason there. Like say you added a branch library, you would want to add a group, and then you would report all that data for your branch location. So for most of you, I don't think anybody's added a branch or a bookmobile. If that occurs, give me a call, and we can talk you through adding this group of adding this section to your survey. Okay. So then in the next part, you'll notice a lot of these are locked. These are codes that we report to IMLS. This doesn't change from year to year. The only thing that you will notice here is 2.33, and it doesn't, so that calculates all your public service hours. So like up above, we entered 520, but the reason that we don't see it down here is because we need to save this page first. So if we click on save, it should populate that to the 520. And the reason it doesn't do that automatically is because of those libraries that have branch locations. So the program is calculating the sum of all of the public service hours for each branch location and a bookmobile if you had a bookmobile. So that would be like for all of those locations, it would add the total. And then this is another COVID question that was asked last year. It asks, were any of your libraries outlets physically closed for any period of time due to COVID? You would just enter a yes or no. If you close for another reason, this is still a no, because they're only asking about closures because of COVID. I would anticipate that would probably be removed next year as well. And so then in the next section, the start of the finance section, we have the start date of your fiscal year and the end date. This will be pre-populated just a year from what you had entered the year before. For most libraries, this is either going to mirror the federal fiscal year, which is October 1 through September 30th, or the state fiscal year, which is July 1 through June 30th. And we have a handful of libraries that have calendar year fiscal years, so that's January through December. This will be pre-filled based upon what you had entered before. So then next we have the revenue section. So in 3.3, you would enter the revenue. And the thing to keep in mind here with the revenue reporting is you report funds that are available to you. So your budget, not necessarily what you spent throughout the year, but whatever your budget was. So if it was funds that you received from the city or the village, you would report those here in 3.3. Typically, these are nice round numbers. Typically, budget numbers are nice round numbers. It would be unusual for this to be like something like 8023. Generally, 8,000. And this is one thing that may not change from year to year. So your budget may be the same from year to year. So it wouldn't be uncommon for your revenue to be the same as the prior year. It doesn't typically trigger an edit check. And then for townships, if you receive money from a township, you would enter the name of the township here in 3.4, and then the amount that you've received from them in 3.5. And if you'll notice here, we have this add group and remove group button. If we click on the add group, we can show you what that looks like. This would be if you receive money from more than one township. So it looks like in the test survey, we've already done this. This is what it would look like. You see two instances of 3.4 and 3.5. We received, in this example, $500 from Township 1, $300 from Township 2. And then we have another one here. It'd be unusual to receive more funds from multiple townships. And if you don't receive money from any township, you can always just put an NA here and a 0 if you want, or just leave it blank as well. Usually when I look over your survey after you submit it, if it's blank, I'll go ahead and enter an NA and a 0 for those. And then we have other local government revenue. This would be if you received money from another local government source. You would just enter, who the money came from here in the description, and then the amount down here. For most people, that's going to be an NA and a 0, but say you did receive some money from a local government agency, this is where you would enter it. And then you'll notice here, the purple one, IMLS only wants to know the total local government revenue. They don't want to know all the sources. So this just sums all of the amounts that you've entered up above. That's what we report to them. And then for state government revenue, these are the common ones. State aid. If you receive state aid through us, this will be pre-filled on your survey. If you're accredited, it'll be pre-filled with what you received for the accreditation. Or if you receive dollars from data, that $200, that would be entered here, pre-filled for you. We don't pre-fill the NLC grant information. I found that was really hard with different libraries having different fiscal years and then receiving the money at different times. It was really hard to get that data and pre-fill it. So that's why we don't pre-fill it for you, but most of the time, if you check your records and you receive the money within your fiscal year, you would just report, like here, if you received a youth grant or a continuing education grant or other state government revenue, that would be like an internship grant. If you received that, you would report that there. Or if you received money from another state government agency, that would be unusual. Most of the time, libraries would receive their state government funding through us, the Library Commission. But if for some reason it came from another agency, you would just enter that here under the 3.14. And then for federal government revenue, so one thing to note here is that federal library improvement grants are issued through us at the commission, but we're just the pass-through agency for that. They actually come from funding through the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. And so because we're only the pass-through agency, if you received a library improvement grant through us, you would report that here. And that would also include the ARPA funding, because the ARPA funding first went to IMLS, and then IMLS passed it through to us, and then we passed it through to library improvement grants and the current formula grants as well. Through us. So if you receive that money, you would report, if it was a library improvement grant, you would report it here in the 3.16. If it was an ARPA formula grant, you would report it here under 3.17 and 3.18. That also includes CARES Act grants. That would be if you received the ARPA formula grant or the money during this fiscal year, not necessarily where you spent it. So it would be somewhat common for you to receive the money during this fiscal year and report it on this year's survey, and then report the expenditure on next year's survey. So that's not unusual for that to happen. So say you received your ARPA formula grant here, you could put that in the description, or if it was a CARES Act grant, you could put that there, or another source. There may be another federal agency, like I've had libraries a couple times, I think, that have received money from the USDA, they would just put USDA here and then the amount that they received there. So say that was like $3,000, you would just report it that way. And then again, you'll see this add group, remove group. If you had multiple grants, like say you had an ARPA formula grant and a CARES Act grant, you could just click on this add group and then add the CARES Act grant, just like you would here, the description and then the amount. Okay, that's kind of a common question that we get with that. Let's move along unless we have questions. So then we have the total here of federal government revenue. Anytime we can have Bibliostat do the math for us, we like that. Then we don't have to do math. Then we have the other revenue section. This includes lender compensation. If you received lender compensation from the commission, you would enter that here. If you go to our website and type in the search box, lender compensation up in the right-hand corner in the search box, those reports are on the website. If you don't remember, if you received lender comp and you don't remember the amounts, you can go to our website and pull that up just by typing lender compensation in the search. And those reports, I think they post them quarterly. So then you can just calculate, for each of those 4 quarters, what the total is. And then regional library system grants, like say you received a grant from Central Plains Library System, you would put that here. And then we have the other section. Generally speaking, this would be like private foundations or funds. Kreutz-Bennett was a common one that would, a private grant that would get entered here into the 3.22 and 3.23. You would just enter the source.
Sam, a question that came up is that where they would count it if their friends group got a donation?
Yep. So that's another common one, friends group, and then you would put the amount down here in the 3.23. Fundraisers is another common one. Memorials, just enter it like that. And it's kind of up to you if you want to itemize each and every. I have a couple libraries that like to itemize each and every one under this add group, remove group. They put $200 here, $100 here, and so on and so forth. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't matter to me if you want to just combine those here. I have other libraries that like to just put, and then miscellaneous. You could do that and then just report the total there too. It doesn't matter on my end. That's more for you if you want to itemize everything. Some libraries like to do that, others don't. So it's kind of a judgment call, but yeah, that would go under this other part. And then we had a question, I actually had a question this morning from a library about E-rate funds. Most of the time, E-rate funds just come to you in the form of a discount on your internet service. And so if that's the case, you don't report E-rate funds at all because it doesn't pass through you. As the library, you just get the discount on your bill. But sometimes you actually do get the funds. I know that there's some possibility that some libraries may have gotten E-rate funding. You report that under this 3.22 because the Universal Service Fund, technically, I think the description is that it's not a federal agency. And so you would just put E-rate or Universal Service Fund, USF, E-rate, something like that there, and then the amount that you receive there. But that's where E-rate would go if you receive it. But if you receive just a discount, don't report it at all. Okay.
Another question in the chat. What if the city pays a bill? So example, memorial books, and then their foundation pays the city. How would they report that?
Can you say that again about the books? So the city.
What if the city pays a bill, for example, like for a memorial book? Would their foundation just pay the city, and how do they track all of that?
Yeah, so generally you would want to try and report that, as a, like, if I understand the example, and correct me if I'm wrong, so you're saying the city, like, instead of sending the funding through the library, maybe the city pays a bill like for insurance or contracts for services, something like that.
Like if the city pays the bill for books that are bought for a memorial, in memory of someone,
Yeah.
then and then the foundation then goes ahead and pays the city.
Mhm.
So how would they?
So I would, in a circumstance like that, like say it was $500, I would report that as foundation revenue. I would put foundation and the amount here.
That answered it for her. Thank you.
Okay. And so then you have some totals here, total other revenue and then total operating revenue. Generally, you might want to look at the total here, and if there's a large change, you might say, well, did I miss something from last year? This may trigger an edit check because it's a large change from the prior year. And it looks like in the previous test survey, we've entered a note here. City didn't give us the money that they did last year, unfortunately. So then we have the capital projects. This triggers some questions sometimes about what qualifies as a capital revenue and a capital expenditure. There's a definition here. Generally, this would be like if the city or another funding source allocated money to the library for a special one-time major capital improvement. And you'll notice here there's examples that are given, like for a new building, a renovation, new vehicles, like a new HVAC system, a new roof, new windows, stuff like that. Generally as a capital project that would result in allocated funding that would be on top of your operating budget. This is where you would report those capital revenue funds. And so, like say in this circumstance, you had to have a new roof installed, and the city, allocated $5,000 for that. You would just report the $5,000 there. If it came from the state government source, you would report that here, or federal source there, or the other section. I would say some common ones. Sometimes we've had libraries that have gotten insurance settlements. There was one circumstance, I think the library got hit by a tornado and they had collected an insurance policy to repair the roof and do some other repairs. And so they reported that in this other section here for those capital improvements. And then we have a series of questions about non-resident fees. We collect that at the state level. We kind of want to know, does your library charge a non-resident fee? That would be people, say that lived outside of your legal service area or outside your, say the library served the town, but maybe charged a fee for people within the county to use the library. So if those people could come and use the library for and pay a non-resident fee, you just enter a yes here, and then like here, looks like last year, those were out of town residents. You could just do a copy and paste there. Yep.
Can we skip back to 3.26?
Sure.
Someone has a question on that.
So that's capital revenue?
Yes. If the library foundation paid the bills for a renovation, then they wouldn't have to report it in that section, would they?
If it was a capital improvement or just something that was like generally
like our Arapahoe
operating
location, they just went through a major renovation and the foundation paid that.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
would they have to track that there?
You generally would want to report it under here in the other section, then you could add a note indicating that it came from the foundation. But if for some reason you didn't want to report it for reasons that we'll maybe not go into, that's a possibility that it wouldn't show up on this report, but that's where you would probably report it here is under this other section, and then indicate that the foundation paid for this major renovation. I know some libraries don't like to do that because then, the city might reduce their allocation or their funding. And so there's a reason why you might not want to report it for that reason, but this is where it would typically go. If that's kind of doing a dance around an issue that might be more complicated. Does that help?
Yep,
Yeah.
that answered
Okay.
it. Thank you.
So let's move on. So then like on that non-resident fee, if you charge a fee, we just want to know what it is. And again, that's kind of like if one library is looking to not charge a fee or charge a fee, they might want to look at neighboring communities and find out what they charge. Or within the county, if there's other libraries within the county that charge a non-resident fee. So then, yeah.
Sorry, another question. What about insurance when the building isn't destroyed? They just had huge water leaks and had to have the roof fixed, drywall replaced and painted, carpet cleaned, bookcases replaced. Where would they?
Yeah, so I would say that if the repairs would fall under this capital improvement or capital thing, as far as a capital project. So is it a major one-time project? Are those repairs like a one-time deal? And it sounds like in that circumstance they would be. I would report that as in the capital revenue part. If it's general maintenance, maybe that would occur, then you would report it in that other revenue section that we talked about before. What was it? Let me see if I can go back there. In this section here, 3.22, you could put insurance payment if that was an operating thing, but generally insurance payments are going to be a capital type thing because it's a repair to the roof, or it's a replacement of a window, hail damage, stuff like that. This would be the other place that you would put it if it was mostly general operating expenditures instead of a capital project. So it's possible that it could be here based upon the nature of the damage. Okay. And I realize that might be a judgment call on your end for the library.
That answered it. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go to the expenditures part. So one thing to keep in mind for expenditures in the revenue part, we talked about, you report funds that are available to you, not necessarily what you spent. So it's pretty common for revenue to be nice round numbers. For the most part, there are some exceptions to that. It would be unusual for expenditures because you report what you actually spent. It's unusual for these to be nice round numbers. So
do they necessarily have to match your expenditures?
No, and they don't. It would be unusual that they would match to the dollar. That would probably trigger an edit check if they were exact. We wouldn't expect that to occur. This would be unusual, say for instance, if our salary and wages were $71,987 last year, and then this year they're 70,000. This to me looks like somebody just made this number up and threw it in there. And it would be unusual for that to be like that amount. It would be more common for this to be like, I don't know, say you're getting paid a little bit more, it'd be like 70, something like that. So the thing to keep in mind is report what you actually spent for salaries and wages. And then for employee benefits, one of the common questions that we get, we have a lot of libraries that say, but we don't get any benefits, or there aren't any benefits paid. This number shouldn't be a zero because you report withholdings for Social Security and FICA. So whatever the employer withheld from your paycheck for those amounts, you would report it here. So the only time this should be a zero, and it does happen rarely, but sometimes, would be if the librarian was paid as an independent contractor and there weren't any withholdings. There's maybe a couple instances of that, but it's pretty rare. most of the time Social Security is at least is withheld from your paycheck.
And Sam, are those based on your budgeted, or would they need to be based on actual expenses paid?
Based on your actual expenditure. So if there was a budgeted amount for salaries and wages and employee benefits, you don't report that here. You just report what was actually spent during the fiscal year. Okay. So then 3.38 is the total. This just totals these two amounts up here. And then we have a series of check marks just for the library director. We want to know, if these benefits were paid to the library director. Again, this is kind of like we get questions about, say one library director wants to compare their salary with salary and benefits to like a neighboring community or a library of similar size. They might want to look at this and say, hey, I'm the only librarian in my peer group that doesn't have family leave, and maybe advocate for that with the city council. So these are kind of the common ones. If it's another benefit, just enter that there. That's the reason we collect that data. So that's the finance part. And then we'll head into library collections. And the finance part has not changed from last year. That should be exactly the same. Library collections, I think, is mostly the same. I think there's a couple new questions. Library services is where we get the program changes that we'll get into. So, we have one more finance part. I didn't read it correctly. So this is collection expenditures. So we want to know what you spent on library materials in print format. So this would be what you actually spent on books, magazines, anything in print format you would report here in 3.50. And then in 3.51, this is expenditures for library materials in electronic format. It's common for this number to be 500 because that's, if you're in the overdrive consortium, that's the same from year to year. This used to trigger an edit check for everyone because it was the same, and it said, this is the same as last year. And we've since turned that edit check off, and we go and pre-populate it before we submit the data to IMLS. So you shouldn't get that edit check anymore, which is nice. Then when I get the data at the end, after every survey has been submitted, I'll go back in and add that note that just says, the overdrive consortium fee didn't change from year to year. If you don't have overdrive, this is just a 0 or another vendor. I think it's uncommon to have a vendor other than overdrive, but it's possible. And then for other materials, this is where you report your expenditures for everything else in the collection that would circulate. So audio and the common things are CDs, DVDs, playaways, cake pans, puzzles, stuff like that are in the collection. Whatever you spent during the fiscal year on those, you would just put that amount there. And then that would total to your total collection expenditures here in 3.53. And then we have this other category. This is other operating expenditures. So we want to know what you spent on computers, computer hardware, accessories, software. Printers would go under here if you had a printer that you purchased. And then electronic access. The common one here is your Opec fees. So say you had Bibliostat for your Opec vendor and they charge, whatever it is, say it's $800. For your online OPAC, you would report that here. Or if you didn't have one, you would just put a 0. And then what you spend on continuing education. And then we have this miscellaneous category. We used to itemize all these things, and then we found, well, it wasn't really important for us to know what you spent on each of these categories. So these are kind of the common ones. If you pay rent for the facility, what you spent during the fiscal year for utilities, office supplies, insurance, and anything else. And again, I know somebody's going to ask probably about if the city pays these directly. You do report the expenditure here. Yeah.
Sam, is that a combination of the health insurance and property insurance, or is it just property insurance?
Yeah, so health insurance would probably get reported under that employee benefits part. Yeah, up above that we talked about. This would be more common, like like fire damage insurance or tornado insurance, some natural disasters and things like that, or liability insurance for the building. If it was employees' health insurance, that would probably go under the benefits part.
Okay.
And then common contracts for services would be like lawn care, snow removal. Some libraries have janitorial contracts for services, or maintenance contracts, things like that. You would include those here. And then we have a lot of totals here. Total other, and then the total operating. And then this is the total capital expenditures. So as we talked about before, like say the library received an insurance settlement because they got hit by they had hail damage or a tornado or something, and they got an insurance settlement, and then they spent that money for like new windows or a new roof. You would report the expenditure here. So it's possible that the revenue would be reported on one year's survey and then the expenditure on the next year's survey. Like say if the repairs weren't done right away. Okay. So now we go into collections. Now we're in the collections part. So this is part 4. This hasn't changed, like I said. We have a couple of changes to the other materials category, I think is where is now a national question.
One thing back on the insurance, Sam, does that cover art?
I'm not sure what you mean by art.
It's from the Grand Island office or Grand Island Library.
Oh, like the artwork in the library is insured?
Yeah.
And you pay a fee for that insurance? Yeah, I would report that under that miscellaneous category. Does that help, Celine?
Yeah, we had a big crane art that was donated to the foundation, and then I think the foundation gave it to the city, and then the city has to cover all the insurance on it. So I have to look it up to make sure, but I'm thinking it's going to be kind of a lot of reporting in different spots. So
right, and it's possible that that insurance policy may be like under an umbrella policy that the city has, and if that's the case, I wouldn't even report it at all.
Okay, thank you.
Because you might not be able to parse that out. Okay, so then we have number of books held. This will be pre-filled from whatever your ending number was last year. So if at the end of the prior year, your library had or held 12,100 books, this will be your starting number will be pre-filled with what it was from the prior year. And then you just enter the number of books that you added during the year and the number you weeded during the year here to calculate the total of books at the end of the year.
Sam, a library is bringing up, they get donations of paperback books that circulate. They can add those in there, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't necessarily have to be, if you'll notice here, like up at the top, it says, under this category, report only items that the library has acquired as a part of the collection, whether purchased, leased, licensed, or donated as gifts. So if they're donated and they become part of the circulating collection, yep, you would report them here.
Perfect.
Okay. So number added, number weeded. And then IMLS just wants to know the total. We want to know the number of added and weeded because that I think feeds into the accreditation application. There's I think it's 3% of your collection has to be weeded. So that feeds into that. You'll notice here for ebooks, there's a great big long definition of what counts as an ebook. The good news is if your library is in the Nebraska Overdrive Libraries group, this is pre-filled for you based upon that. And this was a proposal at one time to get rid of the holdings numbers for these because A lot of the time these items are leased, they come into the collection, they go out of the collection within the fiscal year. They have a certain number of uses. My feelings wouldn't be hurt if the holdings numbers were deleted and we just counted circulation of overdrive. So far that hasn't happened at the national level. So basically this number is a snapshot of the consortia holdings, at a particular period of time. So for overdrive, that's pre-filled in the 4.5. If you have another vendor, you would add those ebooks to 4.6 if it's like another consortia holding, a shared collection. If your library purchased titles directly, either as a part of an overdrive advantage or advantage plus, you would put those in 4.7 here. Like say you had 5 titles that you purchased in your overdrive advantage during the fiscal year, you report those there. And then 4.8 is just the total. So for most people, these are going to be zeros, unless you had an advantage title. Grand Island probably has a number for 4.7 because they probably have some advantage titles that they purchased locally. And then the same thing for audio physical units. These will be CDs. This should look familiar. Starting number, number added, number weeded, and then number held at the end of the year here.
Sam, would they need to get collection numbers if they have access to Hoopla?
So that probably came from Celine as well. So Hoopla is an interesting thing because nationally, and this has been the source of a lot of debate. Another service I think is Canopy that some libraries are offering at the national level. I haven't had too many libraries in Nebraska that have offered Canopy, but Hoopla is a more common one. And so for the definition of ebooks and audiobooks, it says that if the item is permanently retained by the patron, you report it as a database. If it's not, if it has a set circulation period, you report it here in the ebook, audiobook, downloadable video part. And so with Hoopla, if my understanding is correct and things have not changed, it's patron-driven acquisition and there is a set circulation period. And so generally what we've told libraries in that circumstance is you report, like say you had 1,000 ebooks that were purchased directly by the library through Hoopla, you would report that here as the number acquired. You wouldn't report the entire Hoopla catalog. And then for the circulation, you would also report 1,000 titles, if that makes sense. But nationally, some libraries have reported Hoopla as a database, and they report the uses there. I guess from my perspective, if you want to get technical and report it where it says to report it based upon the federal definition, because they're not permanently retained, you would report them here, and then you report the circulation in the library services part. Does that help, Celine?
That actually was Cecilia in.
Oh,
Wasn't me.
in North Platte.
But I put down lots of notes for that one. Thanks.
This is Cecilia. I know exactly what you're saying, but we don't get to acquire and keep them. It is just driven by the patrons' checkouts. I don't know even how I go about getting numbers for that one. So that'll be an interesting one to try and research and figure out.
Well, and the option is to always enter Hoopla as a database. And if you have the number of uses throughout the year, you could just put Hoopla and then the uses in that in the database section, or what they call it an electronic collection.
Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Thank you.
I think Lincoln is doing that now. They were reporting it the other way, and then I think they started doing it as reporting it in the database part. And I'm perfectly fine with that. But nationally, this has been the source of a lot of debate. So then we have audio physical units, like we said, these CDs, audio downloadable units, audio books. Again, this will be pre-filled with the overdrive number. If you had another consortia holding, you'd put it there. A lot of the time, we used to have numbers for this because we had a central digital co-op. It's my understanding that that's now been completely absorbed by overdrive. And so, like, what was it? RB Digital owned, there was an audiobook company, I can't remember the name of it, that used to get reported here, but now since that's all part of overdrive, you just have the number up here for the overdrive number. And then if you had local titles that you purchased as part of an Advantage or Advantage Plus, you would put those here. And then the total audio downloadable. And then video physical units, these would be DVDs, number added, number deleted. And then video downloadables. For some of you that are in the Overdrive Consortium, since they have video now, this number is 188 and it'll be pre-filled. This was triggering an edit check because the change went from 0 to 188. And so I just turned that off. So again, that's a note that I'll pre-fill at the end so that you don't have to worry about that. But I have had questions from a couple libraries that have went in and said, I don't have any video downloadables, and wanted to know about this 188 number here. That's because these are now available through Overdrive. So through the consortium now has video. And then we have print serial subscriptions. This used to be a national question, and you'll notice now it's not in purple. So the states voted to remove this as a national question. We still ask it at the state level for now, at least. These are your subscriptions to like newspapers and magazines. Again, starting number added, number weeded. I'm not sure that's super important to collect, but we decided for the time being we're going to leave it on the survey since we've had it on there for a long time. And then we have this other materials category. We have some kind of common things that circulate to the public here. This might need to be updated a little bit, I would say, in this day and age. Most of the time, cake pans is definitely the most common one that I see here. Some children's kits sometimes circulate, backpacks and things. Wi-Fi hotspots would be another one that would, if they circulate to the public. Puzzles, games, things like that. You just enter a description here. So say you had cake pans, puzzles. I had one library that wanted this field. They had a lot of stuff and they wanted this to be longer. If it's not long enough, you could always just put C note and then write it in the note field. Like if it wasn't long enough, or just put miscellaneous is fine too. If you list a couple things and then put miscellaneous, I'm okay with that too. And if you'll notice here, like down here at the total, this is now a purple question. So this is now a national question for other materials. So we now ask that at the national level. So in here we have a bunch of totals, total materials held at the end of the previous year, total added during the year, withdrawn, and then total holdings at the end of the fiscal year. And then what we report to IMLS is the total physical items in the collection. So we omit the overdrive holdings, which are inflated numbers anyway, because those are consortia holdings. So this is what we report to them. Okay. And I'm surprised that Collect has not thrown us any error codes. This is great. Maybe they got the problem fixed. So then we head into library services. Now it'll probably happen on the next page. Number of registered borrowers. I'm going to click on the little question mark. You probably won't see it. The key part to this definition is for registered borrowers. IMLS recommends that every 3 years you purge your files. So for registered borrowers, they recommend that every 3 years you kind of go through your records to, like if people have moved, to purge your records for that. These are people that have a library card or borrowing privileges through your library. You would not count non-resident cards here, I don't think. Yes. So a registered borrower is a library user who has applied for and received an identification number that has established conditions that they may borrow materials or gain access. So I guess that would include non-resident cards because they would have borrowing privileges. Annual library visits. Number of people that visited the library. And you'll notice here, we have a new question here. And you'll notice this throughout the survey. IMLS has added this to a number of questions. They want to know this number of library visits. You know, is it an actual count? Do you have a door counter and counted everybody that came through, or is it an estimate based upon a typical week or weeks? It's definitely okay to estimate this number. They just want to know if it is an estimate or is it an actual count. So you just select from the pull down menu here. Same thing with reference transactions. You would actual count or an annual estimate. We get some questions about reference transactions. If you click on this little question mark, you get this great big long definition about what counts. Kind of the common questions that we get. If you pull this up, reference transactions generally are information consultations in which library staff recommend, interpret, evaluate, or use information resources to help others meet particular information needs. The key point is you exclude or don't count directional transactions. And so if we use as an example, like say I came into the Grand Island Public Library and I asked Celine, I'm writing a book report on alligators. Can you show me some resources in your library that would help me with my report? And Celine showed me some materials, how to use, like, say, a database in the library or computer to do research for my report. That would be a reference. They would count that as a reference transaction. Say I came into the Grand Island Public Library and said, where's the restroom? That's a directional transaction that you don't count as a reference transaction. So that's kind of the common thing. And again, you can estimate this number based upon an average week. So you could track them during a typical week or weeks, and then report the average for the year. Just make sure that you selected the estimate for that under here. Annual uses of public internet computers. The key thing here is you count hardwired computers like in your computer lab. Some libraries now are checking out computers for in-house use, like say a Chromebook or a tablet computer. They can't leave the library, but they can be used on the library grounds. You would count those also here under public internet computers. Anything that's connected to the internet. Things that you wouldn't count would be like, say you had an Opec computer that just that wasn't connected to the internet, but say your local, say if your catalog was held locally, you wouldn't count that here. Some AWE stations aren't connected to the internet. You wouldn't count those here as well. Just devices that have public internet connection. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in a computer lab. If it was like a Chromebook or a laptop, we would still count those. And then again, the typical weeks, is it an actual count or an estimate? And then we have the circulation parts. We want to know how many times, do we have a question?
Yeah, what about people needing computers or computer help, like resumes, filling out an application? Is that a reference question?
That would be a reference transaction, yes. And during the course of that conversation, it could potentially be 2 or 3 different reference transactions. You know, like say they came in and said, I want help finding job resources. and during the course of your conversation with that person, maybe you helped them with something else. It's possible that it could count as 2 or 3 reference transactions based upon the nature of the conversation. Okay, so for circulation, this can be kind of tricky sometimes because we have it broken down into adult materials and children's materials. So I usually tell people if you don't know, like obviously if things are in your catalog and they're cataloged as a children's item, that you would count that as a children's circulation. Sometimes there's things that maybe are difficult to determine which category they would go into. I would say if that's the case, I always tell people just lump it into adult materials here. There are some video items that may be difficult to. It's a judgment call on your end. If it's cataloged as a children's item, or your reports that you run, if you can differentiate that way. The overdrive stuff here, 5.9, this is circulation of adult downloadable materials like overdrive. This will be pre-filled with your overdrive number for your circulation. If you have another vendor, you'll have to add to that number. Say you had RB Digital or something else, some other vendor. This would be like if you chose to report Hoopla in the holdings and circulation part instead of the database part, you would add to that number here. If you're reporting it as a database, it would get reported later on. And then children's downloadables, this will again be pre-filled with your overdrive numbers. And then we have the total annual circulation of children's materials here. That's just your physical items and electronic items. And then here we have this new category. This is that new question. So it's now a national question to report your holdings for other physical items. Those would be like cake pans, puzzles, Wi-Fi hotspots would be another physical item that circulates. You would report the circulation here. So I think in previous years, those usually get lumped into the adult circulation. So you'd want to separate those out. So like your cake pan circulation, if you held those, that would get reported here in the 5.14 for those other items, since that's now a national question. Now we have a lot of totals, total physical item circulation, use of electronic materials, that's the overdrive, and then total circulation of library materials, total physical and total electronic. And then here's the database part that we talked about. We chose to keep this as a database definition, but the federal definition changed. They don't call them databases anymore. They call them electronic collections, which we found was confusing because electronic collections kind of sounds like overdrive. So we found that that databases was something that people, kind of made a little bit more sense. So in this case, like, say if North Platte had Hoopla, say they had Hoopla and Mango languages that were locally funded databases, they would just report the total number here. That would be 2. Or if they had Hoopla, Mango languages, and say Chilton's auto repair, they would report a 3 here. And then in the 5.19, we used to have you itemize all these. We don't do that anymore. Just list them here and separate by a comma. So you would just put Hoopla, Mango languages, and what I said, Chilton's. You just itemize them there.
So
And
Sam,
then-
if they only have overdrive, those numbers are already included.
Yep. So if you had overdrive, this would be a 0 for you because that's already reported in that other section. Overdrive, you wouldn't double count overdrive here as a database. Only if you have one of these other databases. So yeah, none of the overdrive stuff gets reported here because that's in the ebook audiobook part. Okay. And then, so if you had a report like in Cecilia's circumstance, like if she knew how many times Hoopla got used, how many times Mango Languages got used throughout the year, you would just total those all up and then add the number here. So say that was 20,002 or whatever it was, put that there. If for some reason you can't get those uses from your report, just enter an NA. And then we'll go through later, and there's a code that we use for IMLS that will report that the data is not available. There was a proposal, I think, there was a proposal to change the definition for a lot of this database use, and it hasn't really gained much traction. I know that some states have wanted to change this to report the number of searches or sessions, which I think would be like really hard to do and a really inflated number. But so far we haven't seen anything come through from IMLS about a potential change. And then in 5.21, this is pre-filled with 26. That's Nebraska Access. So those are the databases that are funded by the Library Commission. Used to be 25, we now have 26. So then you have a lot of totals here, total licensed databases, and then total electronic content use. What that is that's the usage of, so like in the example that we gave above about Hoopla, so that would total your Overdrive and your Hoopla use. So your total database use and your total ebook, audiobook, downloadable video use is what we report to IMLS for electronic content use. And then total collection use. So that's your total print, electronic, and other, and then total database use. So we have total interlibrary loans. So total materials loaned to other libraries. So if you participate in an interlibrary loan and you interlibrary loan 15 items during the fiscal year, you just put a 15 here. Borrowed from other libraries, report that number here. One thing to keep in mind, a common question with 5.26 is you include, for interlibrary loan, you include book club kits that are borrowed from, like say the Library Commission or the systems. So sometimes the systems have book club kits that they lend out, and you report the total number of titles. So if you borrowed a book club kit that had 12 copies of the same book, that's 12 interlibrary loans. So, or if it had 12 books and a video, that would be 13. Well, not 113, 13. So keep that in mind. I know some people were under-reporting this because they weren't reporting those or including those as interlibrary loans, and you would report that here. Nebraska card registrations, if you participate in that program, just the number of cards that you've issued throughout the year. And then we added this as a state question. We had some libraries that have Overdrive Advantage Plus accounts, and they share their titles back through to the consortium. And we wanted to give them credit for that. So we thought we'd add this, just a simple two-part question here. If you are an Overdrive Advantage member, do you share your titles to the Advantage Plus option? So if that's a yes, just select that from the drop-down. If you don't have Overdrive, that's an NA. If you purchase titles locally but don't share them back, then you would enter a no here. And if you do share your titles back, we want to know how many times they were used. You can report those here. And the good news is if you click on this little question mark, and you probably can't see it because it doesn't usually show up on Zoom, on that little question mark, there's two links to that Deborah has put on here that go to our website that show you where those reports are at. You can actually pull those reports, are available on our website, that will show you the number of times that those items were used during your fiscal year. So you can click on that and then get the numbers. Sometimes that's nice to know find out, if you shared back the titles, if they're actually being used and how much. So then here's the programs part that we talked about. These are all, this has been totally revamped this year. This is now, we have some new federal questions. And so this part of the survey has changed. And so this first page here is a summary of kind of the layout, the new layout for it. So you can read through this if you want. Kind of the highlight is, we used to have these age categories. We've always collected pre-K programs. This is now a national question for a pre-K category. It shouldn't be much of a change for libraries within Nebraska because we've always included that category. And we have the children's here, age 6 through 11, young adult 12 to 18, adult 19 plus, and we have a new category for general interest. I think that it wouldn't be uncommon to look for it. It wouldn't be surprising to me if at some point we added a category instead of the 19 plus being an adult category, if we had a senior category. I could see that coming. But general interest is nice because we've had a lot of people say, what if we had intergenerational programs, or we had family movie nights, or some of these other things. There's examples here, holiday events that don't really have a specific targeted audience. What do we report those under? You used to report them under adult programs. Now we have this general interest category. You can report them under there. So that's kind of nice. And then out of the programs, we also have live on-site programs. So out of the total programs by age category, we now have subsets where we report how many programs were held on-site, that's within the library grounds, how many were held off-site, and then how many were held virtually. Okay, so if you remember, like in the COVID part, like we had some new COVID programming questions last year, this kind of replaces that. And so here, we've tried to lay out the survey in a way that's easy to follow, because this is kind of a major overhaul. So here did we have a question that my thing popped up?
Yes. The question is, when do you come up with extra questions, and when is it decided to add questions? When do you let the libraries know in order for us to start keeping track of that information throughout the year?
Right. So generally, the way that it works, we have a national conference. All the SDCs or state data coordinators, we just had our conference virtually yesterday and the day before. And so IMLS has a library statistics working group that's made up of 5 SDCs, 5 chief officers. So that'd be the agency directors for states. And then I think some researchers are involved in that as well. And so they kind of decide what questions, like at the national level, might be important to ask on the survey, or to change definitions that already exist. And then if those proposals move forward in the spring, then each state would vote on whether or not to add those to the survey. And if a certain number of states have to vote, I think at 2/3 vote in the process, and the majority votes to add those questions, then they become part of the survey. So we usually find out in spring or early summer when they release the results if those new questions are going to be added. And if it's a major change, we try and, well, in this case, it was a major change, but we didn't know how we were going to, if we were able to add it to our survey, because we could delay the program questions for another year and put them on next year's survey if we wanted to. We decided to add them. And I think I sent an email out in the fall to let directors know, but it's possible in the first year that if it's a new question, you might not be able to answer it because it's brand new. So if for some reason a question's added and you didn't collect the data during the fiscal year and you don't have it, you can always enter an NA. And then, because they usually say it takes 2 years to get good solid data before IMLS really reports it nationally. So even though we're collecting the data, we don't generally say it's data that we can really use for a good 2 years at that level. In this case with programs, a lot of it was stuff that like the pre-K category, we were already collecting that at the state level. So it didn't really create a lot of burden, or hopefully not a lot of burden. Now for state questions, if we want to, if there was something that say it was not a national question, like the overdrive advantage question that we wanted to add, or we felt it was important to add to the survey, we can make that decision to collect that data at the state level and add it to our survey. And definitely, I've heard from a lot of library directors that have asked, it's like the federal questions we can't really change, but there's been library directors that have contacted me that said, hey, why don't you ask this? And we've added that to the survey, or we've removed it from the survey. The only thing is that these purple questions we really can't change because those are national questions. Does that kind of help with the process?
Yeah, that answered the question. Thanks, Sam.
And like we said, we were talking, when we were getting logged in, I think the only new proposal so far from our conference yesterday that really seems like it might move through was to add a question about overdue fines, which I'm not sure is super important to collect at the national level, but the survey burden would be pretty low. So it'd be like a yes or no, do you collect? And I think this, if it ends up being a national question, it would be something like, does your library collect fines, yes or no? And then like maybe 1 or 2 follow-up questions about, is it for certain age groups or certain materials, or do you not collect fines for anything? I think as a part of that, somebody asked about revenue. They wanted to report the revenue from the fines, but I don't really see that going forward because a lot of fines they go into the general fund and they don't go to the library. So I think it would give the false impression that the library was getting the money, and most cases, I don't think they are. Okay. So you would report the number of programs by age group here. So targeted, we're looking at as the targeted audience. We realize this may be a judgment call, so there may be some children's programs that are maybe targeted towards 0 through 11 age groups. So you're gonna have to decide if you want to, report that under 0 through 5 or 6 to 11. Make sure you don't double report. So if you had a children's program, like say you had 3 children's programs that were on site, targeted to age 0 through 5. If you reported a 3 here, don't report a 3 down here. Don't double count. So it's kind of a judgment call on your end. So we have the 0 through 5, 6 through 11, then it sums the total children's programs here because that's somehow still a national question. I think this might be removed next year when all these age groups go into effect. And then 12 through 18, 19 plus, and then here's that general interest category. So we report all of the programs, whether or not they're live, on-site, virtual, on-site, and off-site. So if you had a Zoom program, you would report that here by age group. The only thing that you don't report here are program recordings. So there's a new category that we'll get to in a minute that talks about recorded program presentations. If, for instance, you had a Zoom program targeted, say you had a story hour that you broadcast live, and then you made a recording of it so that people could view later on, you would report it here and in the recorded program presentation section that we'll get to in a minute. If it was just a program recording, you don't report it here. Okay. It's hard to keep track of this stuff because I've been through this 100 times and tried to figure out how we could lay out the survey so that it made sense. Do we have a question? No?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
On 5.62, what if they weren't physically closed for 2021 fiscal year, but they were in 2019, 2020?
What was the question number again?
Oh, she said, not yet, I'm ahead. It was 5.62.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute.
Sorry.
Okay. So, so for the total programs, this is the total program, your total programs by age group is what this is in 5.36. Okay. So then we have a series of 3 follow-up questions here. And if you read this definition, it says, report the programs once. So out of these total programs here that you've reported by age category, we want to know how many were held on site. So in the library or on the library grounds, how many were held off site. So this would be like if you had an outreach program in a nursing home or a preschool or something like that, or farmer's market or some event that was held off site. We would report the total number here. And then how many were live virtual programs? So if you broadcast live via Zoom every Wednesday for story hour, you would report that here. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind is that the total of 5.36, your total programs by age category, needs to equal this 5.39B. So that needs to be the same as the total of your on-site, off-site, and virtual programs.
So Sam, the summer reading programs, they would just be counted up above into the different age groups.
Right, so if you had summer reading for children, so preschoolers, that would be like, say you had 2 of those programs. Say you had 3 for 6 through 11, young adult, whatever it is here. Yep, you would put those under there. We have a separate question later on about summer reading specific programs, but you would also count them as a program in the general programs by age category. So we now have an edit check that'll come up if this number, total programs by age category, and we'll probably put that on the survey next year by age category here, needs to be the same as total programs by how they were held, I guess, on-site, off-site, and virtual. So 5.39B and 5.36 should be the same number. Okay, and then we have program attendance. So this should kind of look familiar with the total number of programs. So you report the number of attendees. For those programs that you've identified above that were targeted to age 0 through 5, you report the total number of attendees at that program. The thing to keep in mind here is that you report the total number of people that attended the program regardless of their age. And so what that means is if you had a story hour for preschoolers, but mom and dad or their older brother or sister attended the program, you would report everyone that was there regardless of their age. That's kind of a common question that people have had. So you report the attendance of 0 through 5, 6 through 11, 12 through 18, 19 plus, and then the general interest here. So this kind of mirrors what we talked about above with the programs. And then, so for total program attendance, then we have those same follow-up questions. How many of the attendees were on site? How many were off site? And how many virtual? So what you would do here is if you had a program, a story hour that was live and in person, but also broadcast via Zoom at the same time. Say you had 20 people that attended in person, those were on-site attendees. And then say you had 10 people that attended via Zoom, you would count them, you would count the 20 up here in the 5.47 and then the 10 down here in the virtual attendees. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that this definition, this federal definition for virtual attendees, because we've had questions about how do you count, like if somebody logs on and you have a group, more than one person in the household that attends virtually, this definition says you count the number of devices. So even though you may have 2 or 3 people in the room that are attending virtually, but if they're all connecting via one device, you don't have to poll them and ask how many people are in the household that are watching. You just count the device, the number of, count that as one device. Okay.
Sam,
That
you're
was
ahead of us because that was the question. Next
That was a
question.
hard thing, yeah.
Yep. And those are all live attendees. You wouldn't count any of the recorded ones. Is that correct?
Yeah, so like that's the other question. So say you had the story time in this example, and you had 20 live attendees on site, and you have 10 virtual here, and then you say you record the session. So that's under recorded program presentations here. So then that story time would then get counted down here because you offered that as a recorded program presentation. And then get this. So the federal definition says that you report the number of views within 7 days after the presentation was posted. So that raises a lot of interesting questions about why 7 days. And the response generally was because some libraries might post the recording at the beginning of the fiscal year and they got a large number of views within their fiscal year. Others might report it or post the recording towards the end of their fiscal year. And so they have a very limited number of views. And so the 7 days is kind of, they developed kind of as a snapshot, I guess, to capture this. We've added as a state question because we've figured libraries were going to push back about the 7 day part. So we added a state question here, which is 5.52, where you can report the number of views within the fiscal year. Now there is a proposal that was discussed yesterday to change the 7 days to 30 days. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes from 7 days to 30 days. If for some reason you don't know how many times this was viewed, you can always just enter an NA here if you don't have that number. And if you click on this question mark, it tells you IMLS has given us some guidance for like how to count Facebook views if things are posted on Facebook, kind of like how to pull those numbers. So you can click on that little question mark and it'll give you some more information. So one thing that I wanted to point out up here is that if you'll notice here for total program attendance by, where it was held, this number likewise should equal total program attendance by age category up here. So that will also trigger an edit check if those two numbers don't match. Okay? Make sense? So then we've also added a state question. We had a lot of questions about self-directed activities, and this was something about 3 or 4 years ago. This was proposed to add this at the national level to count self-directed activities. And it didn't pass, it didn't move forward. but a lot of states were collecting this data about self-directed activities. And I think with the pandemic, a lot of libraries are now offering drop-in activities or passive activities. And so we added this. We actually ripped off the definition from Wisconsin because they had been collecting this for a long time. And so we took their definition and tweaked it a little bit and added it to the survey. We have examples here about these kinds of passive activities. Do-it-yourself stations, 1,000 books before kindergarten, frequent reader clubs, take and make kits. Sometimes libraries, particularly in the children's areas, they might put out like other passive activities for kids to do. If you want to count those on the survey, you now have a spot to report them. So we have them broken down by children's, that's age 11 and younger, young adults 12 through 18, and then adult or general interest we lump into one category here for passive activities. And then here's the summer reading part. So this is a sub part of the programs. We want to know specifically, did you have a summer reading program for children? And then how many participated in the program? Same thing for young adults and adults. And then we do have some COVID related questions that have remained on the survey here that didn't get absorbed by the programs part. So IMLS still wants to collect data for these questions. These are the same as the ones that were asked last year. You know, if your library was physically closed due to COVID, did you continue to provide services? This would be like curbside service, reference services. Trying to think of some of the other ones. Wi-Fi.
Sam, here was where the question
Wi-Fi
was.
outside the library. Yeah.
They were wondering if they weren't physically closed in the 2021 fiscal year, but they were in the 2019, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
How
So
would we fill that out?
this just covers the reporting period for the fiscal year in on this survey. So if you were closed last year, but not the reporting period for this survey, this would be a no. And this is kind of a confusing question because when you read through it, it's like, if you weren't closed. So I'm telling libraries, if you weren't closed at all, this would be a no, or a note saying we weren't closed due to COVID. You know, during the fiscal year, something like that. There actually should be a third option of NA here, but they don't have it. So that was a question that we got last year. We had some libraries say, we weren't closed due to COVID. You know, what do I select, yes or no? We always told them it's a no, and then just put in the note field, we weren't closed. That was the guidance that we got from IMLS on that. 5.63 is a little bit different because it doesn't say, it says during COVID, which technically would cover this reporting period. You know, did you allow the library users to complete registration for library cards online? If you're allowing that, that's a yes. If not, no. Did you provide reference services, or do you provide reference service via the internet or telephone? Only when the library building was physically closed. So again, if you didn't close, that'd be a no. And you could again enter a note saying that you weren't closed. I would expect all these questions I think they wanted to collect these as a snapshot. And because the data collection for some states overlaps, the time periods, they wanted to keep them on for 2 years. And then the outside circulation. So like curbside pickup, did you offer that? Yes or no? And then the Wi-Fi. Did you intentionally provide Wi-Fi or increase access to your Wi-Fi outside the library? And then this was really rare. A lot of our libraries reported no to this. I think nationally they said about 15% of librarians were reassigned during their closures. So for most libraries, they continued to work in the library if they were physically closed due to COVID.
So Sam, would they go ahead and include that in their data if they were already providing Wi-Fi outside before the pandemic?
Like here for question 5.66, I would select a yes, even though they were providing it before. You could enter a note saying we've always provided Wi-Fi outside the building, but since you're providing it technically during COVID-19 pandemic, it would still be a yes.
Okay, thank you.
It's also a confusing question. And hopefully it'll go away next year. We want to know, what ILS you use. Again, we collect this at the state level because if we have one library that says, I don't like my ILS, I'm looking for something new, they might want to contact the library director and say, hey, do you like Biblionics? Or is it, crappy? And, get feedback about it. So that's important to collect at the state level. Do you provide public internet access? Yes or no? If so, the number of internet computers. Again, this would include Chromebooks, tablets, any internet connected device. Doesn't have to be a hardwired computer lab. And then the filtering software, if you filter because of SIPA, we want to know what software you use. Again, that's, to put you in touch with somebody else that might be looking to filter. They might want to contact you and say, hey, is it hard to set up? What's your experience? What did it cost? Who your ISP is, type of connection, is it DSL, cable, fiber optic? And do you provide Wi-Fi? Now there is one change to the Wi-Fi sessions. So this definition has changed. This definition for about 5 years was this sentence right here that's highlighted, which didn't really tell you a whole lot about what to count. It just says it's just said to report the number of Wi-Fi sessions provided by the library annually. And so a lot of libraries reported this based upon what they observed. We saw 3 people bring their laptop in or their phone in, and we think they were using the Wi-Fi. And we think we saw a few people outside. Well, that was probably being underreported, unless you were getting the number from your router or a network log or you had some sort of software. So now the definition has changed. So you don't report those observation estimates anymore. You only report a number here if you've captured the data from a hardware log, your router, network scanning, or other software. So if you don't have that technological means to capture that data and you're just, basing that number on what you observe or an observation estimate, you now report an NA for this number. You don't report it. You don't estimate it based upon what you observe. And the follow-up question is it an actual count or is it an estimate? Or if it's an NA up here, it's an NA down here. This could also be if the library didn't provide Wi-Fi, this would be a 0. And then an NA down here because you don't have Wi-Fi. Now, one of the things that that we're looking at testing is MLS partnered with the GSA to because these data sometimes can be hard to capture. So we now have instructions, and we're looking at building a test module. It's a Raspberry Pi that you put in the library that you can then program to collect Wi-Fi usage. And so we are trying to build a test Pi and see if this is something that libraries could use to capture the data, which would then capture the people that are outside, the people that are there during off hours, at night that would use your Wi-Fi outside, things like that. That would give you a more accurate count. So, and the good news is that Raspberry Pis are pretty cheap. We bought one, I think it was like $120. So if we can kind of narrow that process down and maybe think about getting those instructions out to libraries that don't get the number from a hardware log, that might be a more simple way that they could report this number accurately. And that could possibly be used, like say to, if a library wanted to look at increasing their hours, if they had data that supported, X number of people that are using the Wi-Fi during the off hours, that could maybe support additional staffing or hours changes or things like that. So it's probably important to capture that number accurately. And then we have the maximum download speed. We've finally included a link here to a speed test. If you want to do a speed test, this is the one that the state recommends, the state at OCIO. You just report the range. Obviously, this number, if you do a speed test in the morning when there's nobody around, you might get a high speed. If you did in the afternoon when all the kids are in after school, playing Roblox, this number may be lower. This is kind of the general range. That's why we have you report a range. Does your library have a makerspace? Yes, permanent space. No, we have a temporary, or yes, we have a temporary space. And then no, we don't have space at all. A temporary or shared space would be some libraries that like maybe have makerspace equipment in the closet and they pull it out into the meeting room during certain times. That would be like a temporary space or a shared space.
Sam, how would they count the innovation studios that they had, the innovation machines that they had from the commission when, like McCook said that they had theirs for 6 months?
Right, so that doesn't count because you only count on the survey equipment that you have purchased on your own, because that's a part of a temporary rotating grant. You don't report any of that equipment or yes or no here. Now, if since that project has concluded, you now have a makerspace, or as we get down below, makerspace items, if the library has purchased them or has received them like as a part of a grant or something, and they're permanently housed in the library, then you would report those. If it was the part of that 4 to 6 month process, you don't report that here.
But if they were awarded one and they had it as a permanent feature,
yeah,
of their makerspace,
and I think that's one of the things that, if I remember correctly, I think Joanne was looking at that there are some libraries that are going to be receiving some of the equipment now that the grant's over with. So if you've received it, that would be permanent equipment that you now have, even though you didn't purchase it on your own. It's kind of been donated to you. If you haven't received it yet, but you will be receiving it, it would go on next year's survey as something that you now own or have available. And then there's another national question about virtual visitors to your library's website. The good news here is if your library is hosted by us through the commission, this will be pre-filled. We pull that number if you're one of the Nebraska libraries on the web. If you don't know, just enter a 0. Some libraries have their websites hosted by the city and they can't pull those logs. Just enter a 0 if you don't know. And then for the makerspace technologies, we have a list of drop-down menus of yes or no. Do you own these things? Again, this is stuff that we collect at the state level because say if McCook has a laser cutter and Scottsbluff wants to know, Scottsbluff is looking to purchase a laser cutter, they might want to contact McCook and say, hey, what can your laser cutter do? How much did it cost? Is it easy to maintain? They might have questions. So that's why we collect those data. These are the common things. There's also an other category down here at the bottom. You can enter other. And then if you have these things up here, if you've checked that you own it or have it available, we want to know, do you provide training, formal training or program? on this equipment, or an informal one-on-one training or support, or no training at all. And I think if you enter a no here, this disappears down here. So that's kind of nice that you don't have to go through the whole list. And I think we're getting close to the end. So then another thing that our technology and innovation librarian wanted to ask is, do you offer digital literacy training on these topics? And just these basic categories. Again, formal training, informal training, or no. This can be like a one-on-one that you provide, like kind of in a reference sort of situation, or maybe you have a formal training or formal program that you offer. So then in the staffing part, things to keep in mind here is that for a total number of paid librarians, you report here the total number of people. So if you have 4 people on staff that are librarians, and I've had questions sometimes with, what counts as a librarian, even though a person might not have a librarian in their title. Generally speaking, I would tell libraries, if you have a person that would typically do library type work, such as working the reference desk, working the circulation desk, cataloging, those types of things, I would count that, even if they might have a different title, I would count them as a librarian, because that's typically library work. And so if out of those 4 people, you would count them the total number of hours that they work per week. So let's say if you had 4 people that were all full-time, you would take 4 times 4 times 40, and then you would report 160 hours worked per week. And then you'll notice here that changed to calculate the full-time equivalent to 4. So again, we have Bibliostat do math for us whenever we can. We don't have to do this. It calculates it for us. Total number of people here, total number of hours per week here, and then it calculates the FTE. And then the follow-up question is, they want to know, so out of those total 4 librarians, do any of them have a master's degree from an ALA accredited institution? So if you had 1 person on staff that was full-time that had that degree, you would then just count them there, and then the number of hours, and then it calculates the FTE down here. Or say they were part-time, you just enter 20 there, and that calculates as a half of an FTE. Then we have the non-librarian paid staff. This is where you would put cleaning people, accountants, those would be common. Anybody that you didn't count above that's a paid staff, you would again count the number of people here. So you had a cleaning person and an accountant, you'd count 2, and say they were both 20 hours a week, so 40 total. That then would calculate to 1 FTE for them. And then it calculates the total paid employees. And then we want to know, just wrapping things up at the end, the job title of the director. This is generally director or library director, whatever the director's title is. And then the hourly wage, again, that goes along with collecting those data about library director benefits. So the hourly wage would go here.
Sam, back up to the custodial or cleaning person. If they're a contract worker, they would not be included in that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. If that amount that you would pay to that service would go into that contracts for services that we talked about before, you wouldn't count them here. That's a good question. Yeah. And then just an estimate of the total number of volunteers. I realize that's difficult too sometimes. And then the number of volunteer hours per week. Was there another question? I saw that pop up.
Nope, just that you answered that one. Thank you.
NAFU, okay. So at the end, we have a narrative section. Some people like to just copy and paste their narrative section from their annual report. We just kind of want to know major successes and challenges from the previous year. This is not a required question. I had somebody tell me one time, they said, oh, that was the hardest part of the survey, is wanting to know, trying to figure out what to put in there. And I said, well, it's not a required question. And so, I mean, you don't have to put anything in here if you don't want to, but we do want to know what's going on in your library. And this is an opportunity to provide us some feedback. And then in the certification section, you just put the name of the director or whoever did this report. So in some cases that might be an assistant director. We have a few libraries that some of their board members sometimes enter the data. This is just that we want to know the name of the person if we have questions about the survey, who to contact. So in most cases, that's going to be the library director, and then the title, and then the date.
Sam, back up to the, they only have volunteers during large programs. So they still would count those, correct?
Yeah, you still would count them. Again, that's kind of a difficult thing because you might have a lot of volunteers in the summer, not very many in the winter. So again, you know, if you had 100 during the summer, you know, 100, and then kind of just an estimate of the number of hours that they volunteered per week. And we realize that's not an exact number. It's kind of more of a snapshot estimate. But yeah, you would count them even if they didn't volunteer. If they only volunteered for like a few months, you would still count them. So, and then, so at the end, this kind of gives you an overview of the process of how to submit your survey. It says to verify all the questions have been answered, review any flagged questions, review your edit checks, and then you're ready to submit it. So I would tell people when you're done entering all your data, the first thing to do would be to go over here to the Show Status button and click on that and find out if you've got any required unanswered or required questions that aren't answered, or if you have any edit checks. And you'll notice here when we click on that Show Status button, you get 3 subsections. You get your flagged questions, and it should show the question that we flagged earlier, and it does. See, that's the one that we selected at the beginning. So that's then a reminder to me to get that information from whoever. I can then unflag it here and then just click Save if it's already been taken care of, and then it goes away. And then we have an unanswered questions section here. So we can look at, from this pull down menu, we can look at all of the unanswered questions, or we can look at just the required unanswered questions. So we won't be able to submit our survey if we have required unanswered questions. And since we're just, since we've been breezing through this, we're gonna have a ton of them. So here you'll notice all these in purple. These are questions that we need answers for. Now you can go back in the survey and like this one's a calculation because it's grayed out or it's a pre-filled. So you can either go back to the survey and answer these, or if you know, you can enter them here in the edit check part. So if you know the number of weeks that you had limited occupancy, you can just enter a 0 here. And then down at the bottom, click on this save. And it'll save that here. You don't have to go back to the survey itself to do that. And then for the edit checks, like I said, in explaining the edit checks, it looks at your data from this year and compares it to last year, and then it looks at the data within the survey itself. And so let me scroll down. So like here's a good example here, like for total local government revenue, we only reported $500 this year, but last year we reported $9,500. And it's going to throw an edit check because of that, because that's a large change. So it says local government revenue has had a large change from last year. Please check, you know, or provide an explanation. So we could enter a note here. So say the 500 is correct, and our city was stingy. We can enter a note like that, explaining that you know 500 is correct. You know, or however we want to explain it, depending on the edit check. And then if we click on save, you'll notice now that text went from red to green. So that what that means is that edit check has been satisfied. You've entered a note explaining why this is outside of a certain range. And like I said, for some libraries, we're seeing some of those COVID edit checks that went off last year come back on. So if your programs went up and they were down last year, this may be a copy and paste note. You know, could be just something simple as COVID, you know, that you could then put in the note field to explain that change. For smaller libraries, sometimes a program would go from 1 to 2 or 1 to 5. And the program sometimes looks at that as a ratio, as a like 100% change. And you might get an edit check, even though it's not really that big of a change. If the data is verified, you can always just enter something in the note that says, this is correct. Our programs went from 1 to 2, you know, or whatever the case may be. And if it's a common one, you could always pull up the previous year note and just copy and paste it too. So you didn't have, if it's something that comes up every year. So any questions about the survey itself? If not, I want to show you the supplemental survey, and then I think we're done. And we didn't get any error codes today, which is nice. So maybe they fixed that issue.
I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat.
Okay, so the process for once you submit your survey, oh, wait a minute, let me go back. One more thing I want to show you real quick. So once you've satisfied all your edit checks, the next process is to go over here to the submit button. You then click on submit. And it's going to say we can't submit it because we got unanswered questions and we have edit checks. But if you entered your notes and you answered your unanswered questions, all of these will be green check marks. Okay. And if they are all green check marks, you'll see another button down here. So the submission process is a two-part process. You first hit submit here, and then once everything is green on this side, there'll be another button down there that'll say submit. And just click on that, and then you should get a little pop-up that says your survey has been successfully submitted. It then locks your survey. It then notifies me that your survey has been submitted. And I'll go through and look over your survey. If you have blank questions, I'll usually enter an NA or a 0 for those, just so that everything is consistent. If there's questions about maybe something that you entered, I won't change any of your data. I usually would email you and say, hey, I noticed this or I noticed that, and ask you for some clarification. And then once we've finalized your survey, then I save a I print to a PDF and keep a local copy of your survey on our network. Again, you can log back in anytime and print it from Bibliostat, or if you needed a copy of it, just contact me and I can send it to you via email. If you noticed an error later on, saying maybe something changed and we're still in that data collection window, you can always email me and I can unlock your survey if you need to go back in and make a change to something like that. That happens from time to time where you have to retroactively go back in because a number wasn't accurate or correct. So if that happens, just let me know.
One of our librarians said the only time she's getting error codes was when they get busy doing something else while they're doing their survey. And then that's when the error codes would pop up.
Yeah, and there's a thing too that like, I think there's like a 60-minute time limit. So if you've been in for more than 60 minutes, you get like this little pop-up that says, do you want to stay in? And that feature doesn't really work real well. Basically, you have to shut it down and then restart it. But I was getting pretty consistent error codes at the other 3 libraries. This is the last system training, and I was getting pretty consistent errors at the other ones where it would just lock up and I would get the page couldn't load, and I didn't get it today. So hopefully maybe they've got it resolved. Another thing that I wanted to mention, it's like two things before we call it a day here. So if for some reason you've lost your password, so the Bibliostat password is the same password that we use for the accreditation application and also for our supplemental survey, which we'll show you in a minute. If you've lost your password, you can always email me. You can always call the reference desk. They can pull that password for you. But say you were working on your survey over the weekend and Library Commission's closed on the weekend. You can always go to our website and type in password here. And if you'll notice down here, the third one, it says Bibliostat password ID lookup. You can always go and click on that and enter your city, and it'll automatically generate an email to the library director at that city. So like if it was Grand Island, you could just enter the Grand Island here and click on submit. And that would automatically generate an email that would go to Celine that would say, here's your ID and password. So that's kind of nice if you were, say, working during off hours and you needed your password, and you couldn't get a hold of us. So once your survey's been completed and everything looks good, you will get an email from me saying, thanks for submitting this, and a link to our supplemental survey. And that supplemental survey does not have a time frame. You can enter. It's more for our records on our website. Keeps track of your library staff, your board members, your hours, that type of thing. And we can log into the test. You'll have a link to this page here. You would just enter your ID and password. Log in. And we just like to have you check this at least once a year to make sure that our records are up to date for your staff, your board, your friends group, hours, internet services, and then library photo. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that once you go through this and once you go through each section, there'll be a little green check mark here that the information usually takes about 24 hours to be updated on our site. So we've had libraries that update it and then they go in and they say it's not bad, it's still showing the old board member. Just wait for a day. And if it's not updated after a day, email our IT guy, Vern, down here, and he will check and find out what's going on with that. But generally speaking, it usually takes about a day to update that. I think they do it overnight.
And I know that is extremely important, especially for our system office. We use that a lot in knowing when we can go and visit the libraries. And I know during COVID, a lot of people, their weekend hours, evening hours have changed. So that's important. If everyone can get that updated, that'd be great.
Yeah, and you can do that at any time throughout the year. Like say your staff turned over or something, you can always contact us and we can, take care of the updates as well. But these are updates that you can do on your own. I know that Omaha does it once a month because their staff changes frequently. So once a month they go in and they change their staff, update their staff records. So if things don't change, we just like to have you do this at least once a year to make sure everything's updated. So that's kind of it. Any other questions? And if you have suggestions for how we can improve the survey, I'm always willing to listen. I know I really struggled with these program questions. There were some other states that voted for those changes and then said, oh, I didn't realize this was so comprehensive. I don't know if I can get this added to my survey. And so I felt confident that we were able to add it this year, and hopefully it's not too burdensome, because that's what we're trying to do, is make this as least burdensome to you as we can, while still collecting things that we think are important to collect, and the federal stuff we're required to collect.
Well, thank you, Sam, for coming and joining us this afternoon and helping us learn how to navigate the public library survey via Bibliostat, and help us understand where to track those different numbers and why it's so important that we do track those numbers. So, and for everyone that was on today, I'll make sure your CE hours are turned in to Holly, and we will be providing a recording of this. So if you want to go back and rewatch a certain section, if you get stuck in the middle of your survey and you're like, what did Sam say? It's going to be recorded. So we'll let you know.
Or to hold me accountable too. Well, you said this.
Uh-oh.
Oh, I did? Okay. Yeah. And if you have questions throughout, when you get into the survey, you can always give me a call, send me an email. I can log into your survey on my end too, and look at what you're looking at. If you have any error codes, let me know. I'll forward those on to Bibliostat and hopefully we can get those fixed. Errors printing or anything like that, let me know. And yeah, hopefully. And if you haven't, one more thing, if you haven't filed for your formula grant, make sure you get that in by the end of the year if you haven't done that already. So we will be sending reminders for that, for those libraries as well.
Yeah, we
probably
just
next
sent,
week.
we sent letters out to our system libraries. I think those went out on Tuesday. But I heard this morning, I think Krista said that they're going to extend the end date. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, so that's another thing that like, so I have a lot of vacation that I have to use by the end of the year. And so I think I'm going to be gone between Christmas and New Year's, which is like the deadline. So it's like, well, I think we should extend this maybe into January. So for those libraries that haven't submitted, you'll be getting an email about that extension. It's probably January 14th. We'll extend it to, just for that reason, because it's not really fair to a library that's trying to get things in and not have anyone there to call, like if they had an issue. So we're extending it for that reason. So, and hopefully then we can up the response rate too. So, but yeah, if you have questions, yeah, it's right now it's about 70%. So we're getting there.
We just don't.
Hopefully our
understand.
letters that
Yeah.
that stated the deadline and a once in a lifetime unique opportunity will jog some of them to want to take advantage of the funding.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
When
All right,
we
Sam.
offer them free money, hey, it's free money. Come on.
Yeah.
that's right. Use it. If you don't get it, it's going to somebody else.
Thank you so much, Sam. This is a tremendous assistance to everybody that's
Yep.
trying to fill out this survey. Thank you so
And
much.
I think next year I'm going to shoot for doing these in person again. It kind of worked that one year where I did yours
Right.
and then moved and then went out to Scotts Bluff. So I'd like to do that again next year because it gets me out. And hopefully we can do that.
We'd like to. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys. Need to do this.